So yeah, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about container gardening, and I like to show this because it's kind of funny, but it also is true. When we plant things, sometimes we don't think about how big they're going to get. I've seen people plant, it happens a lot with trees. I think if we plant it kind of close to a house or under our power lines or something, it often grows bigger than what we were expecting. So I like to show that. Okay, that is, oh, actually I have a poll I'm gonna show. See if this works. And this is just another, if you were here for the herb presentation, it's kind of a fun trivia game. Don't feel pressured to know all the answers. It's just kind of some fun facts to get us started. And so, everybody seen that? Okay, looks like there's one more person going. All right, let me see if I can share these results with you now. All right, number one, which of these is a great source of nitrogen for your garden? So we had 90% say coffee grounds, and that is correct. So the other things are just banana peels you can add to your compost or your soil. I don't know if they would necessarily add as much nitrogen as like the coffee grounds do. What insect can eat an entire plant by itself in one day? And I think actually in the first question, I should have put tomato plant because it is the tomato hornworm. They can consume a lot of leaves in one day. So I don't know exactly what this question, if they were saying a full-grown tomato plant or just a baby transplant, but I know that tomato hornworms can cause a lot of damage. And then lastly, we have what vegetables consume the most. So this is kind of a trick question, I think, but it is tomatoes. And I think that's sort of because we eat it, ketchup, pasta sauces, you know, we use tomatoes for lots of things. So that was kind of our fun icebreaker. Let me turn it off now. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about garden planning and kind of the basics of gardening. So if you already have your garden planted or are a master gardener, this might be a little basic for you, but it's good to kind of review every year to remember kind of the key things that a garden needs. So when you're choosing a place for your garden, or if you're thinking about expanding what you already have, we need to think about sunlight. So gardens need at least 6 to 8 hours of full sunlight a day. So if you want to plant things like tomatoes or any kind of thing that will have fruits on it, they need full sun. I like this picture because it shows, it looks like the garden's very close to the home. It's getting lots of light, but somewhere convenient is nice. You don't want to necessarily have your garden far away from where you're going to be every day. You want to think about the soil, water conditions you have, things like that. And then how close is your space going to be to trees and shrubs? my sister bought a house a couple years ago and decided to plant a garden in her backyard, and she planted it right under a giant oak tree. So she probably should have asked me first, but she just went ahead and did it. And the garden did not do very well. One, because it was very shaded throughout the summer, but the oak tree also sucked up a lot of the water and nutrients that those plants needed. So those are some really important things to think about. And I realize some of you might already have your garden planted, but if it doesn't do well this year, if you're thinking about expanding, these are some good things to consider. Okay, so when we're thinking about what to plant, I recommend buying clean, viable, disease-free seed. And that just is because that's going to give you the best results. I had someone that sent me some pictures of their potato plants, and they were just kind of rotten and falling over. And she said that she did not buy seed potatoes that were disease-free. She just used some potatoes she had that were sprouting in her kitchen. So you can do that. It just won't probably give you as good of results if you use that clean, good seed. I like to use recommended varieties, and this is a publication that K-State has of varieties of vegetables that we have tested, and they're proven to do well in Kansas, all across Kansas. So that is a link I will put in the email that I send out at the end. That way you have it. It's a really great resource to use if you need a new variety of tomatoes. There's a whole list of tomatoes that K-State recommends that will do well in the garden. So it's a great like shopping list to take out with you to the nursery. When you are looking at catalogs or at the nursery, think about things that you know you will eat and that your family likes to eat, not just what looks good or what looks pretty in the catalog. That can be tempting, but you don't want to grow things that you won't actually use. And then for difficulty, if you are a beginner or want something really easy over the summer, lettuce is the best. I really like if you have kids that want to help, lettuce is really fun for them. It's probably one of the easiest, and it just grows so quick. It gives them kind of some instant satisfaction of growing. So, and if you didn't get it planted this spring, you can also do a crop of lettuce in the fall, which is another reason why I like it. You can really plant it twice a year. But you can also do things like carrots and fruit crops as well. So those are just a little bit more difficult than leafy greens. So I always tell people to sketch out their garden design, and I know this sounds kind of funny, but it is really helpful to have kind of records of what you've done in the past. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It can be something kind of like this top picture, just really, really simple and quick. That way you know kind of what your plan is, and you can keep this from year to year. I know it's kind of easy to get anxious in the spring and just go out and start planting, but kind of having this plan or a design in mind is the best way to be most efficient. You want to think about how much space you have and how much space the plants will take up. So if you're going to plant pumpkins this year, know that a single pumpkin plant will take up most of a 10 by 10 foot garden. So if you don't have much space, maybe think about planting something else or looking into a smaller variety. So it's just kind of helpful to know where you're going to plant things and how big they plan to get. So this bottom picture is from an app on your phone, which I will show you. So this sounds kind of nerdy, but if you are really into gardening, there are online apps you can use to kind of plan out your garden like I showed you and have record from year to year. So it's fun if you have a smartphone or a computer and really want to get into your garden this year. You can use these to help out. I really like this Burpee garden planner because it has some tips and advice on certain crops as well. So it helps you plan everything out and then keep records of what you planted every year and how those plants did. So, but if you don't want to try an app, it's just a good idea to always keep a journal of what you planted and how it did. That way you remember next year if you want to plant lettuce again or what variety. Okay, so there is a difference between the vegetables that we plant. There are cool season and warm season vegetables. In the cool season ones, we've probably already planted some of those if you have your garden started. They like the cool days of spring and also in the fall, they like those cool days. So really what we're talking about though is the soil temperature. So the cool season vegetables need at least a temperature of 45 degrees to germinate. And then they actually bolt or they go to seed when it gets hot. So a lot of these ones are really thriving right now in kind of our cool temperatures. But then in, late June and July when it gets really hot, they won't do as well. So these ones are my favorite because you can start them early and then you can also often do another crop of them in the fall. The warm season vegetables are ones like our tomatoes, peppers, the ones we like to plant later. We can wait until May or even into June to get them planted. The soil temperature needs to be about 55 degrees. And that is kind of key. If you plant your tomatoes too early and the soil temperature is not there yet, they'll just kind of sit there. And they won't necessarily die, but they're not growing either, and you're stunting the growth. So it does help to wait a little bit on these crops. The soil temperature is how we determine it, not necessarily the temperature we've had during the day. And there's an awesome resource called K-State Mesonet, which is a website that I can give you the link to, but you can type in whatever county you live in, and it will tell you the soil temperature that county is having then, and also the weather and the moisture of the soil. It's a really great resource. I like to check it every couple weeks just to see what's happening around Kansas. So I'll send the link to that so you can kind of see what your soil and your temperatures are doing in your area. Okay, so I have a couple slides about soil, and I don't love talking about soil because it's not one of my favorite things. I'd rather talk about flowers and vegetables, but soil is very important. When I was going to K-State, I had a professor that said if you grow the roots, the top of the plant will take care of itself. And growing the roots really means that we need to focus on having healthy soil. So a lot of times in Kansas, we don't have the best soil conditions. I don't know about everyone, but a lot of times if you just dig up some soil in your yard, it's going to be a really heavy clay. So how you can deal with that is by adding organic matter, any kind of compost. That will really help add nutrients to your soil and break up the effect of that clay. It'll help water to be able to hold better, and just aeration and endless benefits of adding organic matter. Another thing that we like to talk about is pH and nutrients. And we'll talk about soil tests on the next slide, but it is important to know what you're working with in your soil. If you do have heavy clay, make sure you're watering slowly and infrequently. That way it really goes clear down to the roots of the plant. And then we never want to work the soil when it's wet. That can destroy the structure of the soil. You obviously don't want to compact it. If you're using heavy tillers or things like that in your garden, you can damage it. And then if you add sand to clay, a lot of times that is not a good idea because it just fills in the pore spaces and kind of creates a texture that you don't want. So that is not something I recommend. Any kind of organic matter is just going to be best. So, and try not to ever overwork your soil. I know it's tempting in the spring to really till it up and keep tilling, but you don't want really fine flour-like soil. You want your soil to be in small clods. Okay, this chart looks kind of scary. I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. but it really helps if you've never gotten a soil test of your garden or lawn or flower bed. I really recommend it because something we deal with in Kansas is high pH. And pH is just a measure of the ions in the soil. But basically what it means is when we have a high pH in that red zone, you can see that not all the nutrients are being taken up by the plant. So if you see the iron and magnesium, the lines kind of trickle down and it's not being taken up very well. So when we have high pH, the nutrients in the soil cannot be grabbed by the plant. They like it to be neutral or a little bit acidic. And then that is the ideal state for all the nutrients to be taken up by the plant. So it just kind of depends. Usually the soil tests I've seen do have a little bit higher, like 7.5 or 8, but that can be corrected. So if you don't know what pH you have, I do recommend getting a soil test. And that's something Kelsey and I can help you with at your local extension office. So if you've never done that and you really are interested in improving the soil in your garden, then I recommend it because it also tells you very personalized results. So they're going to give you specific recommendations for fertilizer and also how to improve the pH, whether it needs to be lowered or raised for your certain conditions. So if you have any questions about soil testing or pH, that's something Kelsey and I are happy to help with. It seems confusing at first, but it is something that is helpful to know when you're getting started in a garden. I mean, you can do it any time of year. It doesn't have to be before you start planting. Okay, now that we have our perfect soil, we're going to talk about seeding and planting. So really working the soil and getting it nice and healthy is a first step to having success. Once you start planting and seeding, a few tricks are, this seems pretty basic, but using a string to make a straight line is helpful if you've never done that. I planted onions this year, and I will tell you, my line, I thought I was straight when I dug the little trench, but using a string or something like that to really make sure your garden's looking sharp is a good idea. Usually when we're planting seeds or bulbs, you want it to be about 2 times their width. All that information should be on your seed packet. So really make sure you're reading that packet before you're planting. And then you want to make sure that you're watering and keeping them moist until they germinate. Because if you let that seed dry out before it germinates, it will die and not germinate. So make sure you're watering it pretty frequently until you see little leaves come up. Oh, whoops. Okay, sorry. Can you guys see that now? Mm-hmm. Okay, transplants. So this is probably what you're going to be working with now. If you're planting tomatoes or peppers, you want to buy some nice transplants. You want to select ones that are short and stocky and dark green. I know it's tempting to go buy the biggest one. Even sometimes you'll see some that have little tomato fruits on them, and it is tempting to buy those. But if you pick out the short ones and the smaller dark green ones, they'll really take off in your garden faster. And that's just because the roots will really have energy in them and be ready to become part of your garden. So I know it is hard, and it's hard with flowers too. I always want to buy really big bushy flowers, but if you're buying the smaller plants, they really will, the roots will have more energy to start growing in your garden. I always like to recommend looking at the roots before you purchase them. If they have healthy, plump roots, that's what you want, really white, healthy roots. If they're brown and kind of slimy looking, that means the plant is going to die. That's not good. So I always kind of like to check them, even with any plant that you're buying. If you're about to buy a tree, it is kind of helpful to look at the roots in that pot before you purchase that, because if the roots aren't healthy, your plant's not going to do well. So just some tips when you're at the garden center. Another thing I like to talk about is hardening off the plants. So if you go and buy a tomato plant from a greenhouse and go home and put it directly in your garden, it might get a little bit of a shock. It's not going to do as well as if you kind of put it in shade for a day and then set it outside in the morning. So it's just getting used to the intense sunlight and the crazy wind and weather that we have in Kansas. So kind of gently transition it to your garden, and that will be better than just planting it straight out. So. Okay, so one of the really important things that we talk about with gardening is rotating your crops. And that is because we can get some diseases if we don't do that. So this picture on the bottom is of a tomato plant. And I don't know if anybody has ever experienced something like this, but we usually get a lot of calls during the summer with sick tomato leaves. They just look kind of brown. They usually have spots. Sometimes they kind of curl up. And that is because that's a fungus that the tomato gets. And this picture is called septoria leaf spot, and it actually overwinters in the soil. So the little tiny spores of the fungus go down into the soil, and they can live over the winter and then reinfect your tomato the next year. So it's important to try as best you can to move your tomato plant every year. So when I was talking about sketching out your garden or using one of those applications that lets you map out your garden, this is why it's important, because you might forget where your tomato was and where you need to move it for next summer. So, and it doesn't have to be hard. You can simply rotate each family like these pictures are showing. If you only have 2 raised beds, maybe you're planting tomatoes in one of them and then the next year. Anything you can do to try to prevent some of these funguses would be best. Yeah, that's why it's just really nice to have those sketches, or even if you're not interested in drawing out your garden, taking a picture of it so you remember what plants were where. Okay, I'm gonna take a second to see if anybody has any questions before I move on. You can, if you have a question, you can like type it in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask a question. I know I'm going kind of fast over some of this, so.
How often do you need to add organic matter to your garden?
It just depends on your soil type. I don't think it would be bad to do it every year. And it's best to, if you have some leaves or something that's not all the way broken down, to do it in the fall. And that way it can set in there over the fall and winter and kind of decompose to add to your soil. So yeah, it just kind of depends. If you have nice, dark, rich soil, you probably don't need to do it that often. I know I've seen a lot of heavy clay though in my area, so it helps to add it quite often. So,
does a soil test cost money?
Yes, they're not too bad though, because we do send them to K-State and it's tested by the laboratory at K-State. But I think it's usually under $15 or so.
Okay.
So it's not horrible, and they really do give you personalized results of what you need to do to add more nitrogen or add more whatever you need personally for your soil. Okay, so I have a couple slides on watering, and then we'll talk about containers. Watering the garden is kind of an interesting thing. It's hard to know exactly how much water you're putting on and if you're being efficient. But generally we say that sprinklers are not always the best option compared to more of a drip irrigation or soaker hose type of watering. So you can see in this bottom picture that the soaker hose is applying the water right at the root zone. And you're not getting any runoff. It's just going straight to the roots, which is usually what we like to recommend because those active roots are about 12 to 18 inches deep into the soil. So if you can get water right to those roots, that's the best. And this picture shows that the soaker hose or the tubing is kind of buried beneath the ground. You don't have to do that. Just laying some drip irrigation right in your garden is a good idea. So just the advantages of drip tubes or soaker hoses is that you're concentrating the water right down to where the plants need it. You're not getting the foliage of the plants wet. And this is important because with tomatoes, I talked about some of those fungal diseases. They like water and wet conditions. So if you're constantly going out there and sprinkling your tomato plants with water, they can be more prone to some leaf spot diseases. So having water right to the roots is really best. And a lot of times you'll prevent some weeds because you're watering right to the row of your plants instead of sprinkling it all over. Okay, berry varieties and strawberries. Yes, so there are strawberries that do well in Kansas. Specific varieties, okay, berry varieties except strawberries. Yeah, we have like blackberries, raspberries, those type of bushes do really well in Kansas. And I can send a link of the varieties that we recommend, but there are lots of fruits that do well, especially the smaller varieties that usually they bloom a little bit later, so they're not hit by our frost. But yeah, I know like raspberries, blackberries do really well in Kansas. Even some people grow grapes, which I think that's a little bit harder, but yeah, strawberries as well. If anybody grows strawberries, they usually do really good in Kansas. Okay, so when you're watering, I talked about doing longer waterings less often, and that is really helpful for the plants. So you can see when you're watering longer periods but less frequently, the roots really grow and reach down to that water. So if you're just going out and watering just a little bit every day, you're going to have really short, shallow roots that aren't as healthy for your plants. So, and this is once you have your plants established. If you just planted your seeds, you obviously want to make sure you're keeping them very moist. That way they do germinate. But right now, if you have big potato plants growing or onions coming up, you don't have to water them every day. Doing a little bit less frequently is best so that the roots really grow. All right, so we can plant pretty much anything that we plant in the garden in containers, which is really nice. It's definitely less maintenance than if you have a big garden. But I think they're also fun to add to your garden. So even if you do have a raised bed or something like that, adding pots is also fun to have, you know, by your front door or on your deck, just to grow something a little extra. So the benefits of containers is that they are kind of mobile, honestly. So I know they do get heavy, but you can move them wherever you need to. If you're entertaining for a night and you want all your plants on your back deck, you can move them and have a nice jungle for your guests. But there are some cons to containers, such as they will need watered very often. So especially when it gets really, really hot, you know, in the late summer, they will need watered probably every day. So if you don't have that much time to put to it, you might think about either having really big containers that can hold water more or just using a garden. But you can really do anything. This picture shows some herbs. I think there's a tomato in there. Lots of different things. So you think about where you're going to put them. They will need full sun if you're growing tomatoes or anything fruiting. You might choose a protected location. If you're putting them right in the sun in afternoon heat in July, you know, it might be too much. So make sure you're protecting them, and they are susceptible to drying out. So like I said, they will need watered more just because they are, you know, above ground and just they are susceptible to wind and things like that. So when you're watering them, you want to kind of check to make sure that the soil is dry. You can stick your finger in the soil about an inch or so and see if it feels dry. And then when you are watering, you want to make sure that you water until some water comes out the bottom. So you want all your pots to have drain holes, and then water them completely so that water drains out. That way you know you're getting water to the bottom of the roots. There are lots of different types of containers you can use. Large pots are usually best. So if you're wanting to grow a tomato or something that will fruit and grow big over the summer, you want it to have a pot at least 24 inches, 16 to 24 inches, and drain holes in the bottom. So if your pot doesn't have drain holes, it's likely that you'll put on too much water and flood the plant. So make sure you're checking for that before you start planting. There are lots of different types. Plastic pots are probably what you'll find a lot most commonly. They're lightweight and expensive, or less, not very expensive. You can find them pretty cheap. I've seen a lot at our like Dollar General, Walmart, but they're not very durable. So you might have to replace them every year. It just won't last usually. Clay pots are also usually inexpensive. And you know, I love that natural terracotta look that a lot of the clay pots have. But if you leave them outside all year, you have to make sure that if it starts to freeze, the pots can crack. So you might want to plan to bring them inside, and that's the same for some ceramic pots as well. So they're nice and they look good, but you might just plan to bring them in somewhere where they won't crack over the winter. Ceramic pots like these purple ones are really pretty and nice, but they're going to probably be the most expensive that you'll find. But they should last as long as you're protecting them from our freezes in the winter. And you can also get really creative. I know people use wheelbarrows or the baskets of bikes. I think that looks so fun. So you can definitely get creative with your pots. So when we're caring for the pots and planting them, you want to think about using a soilless potting mix. So we don't recommend just going out and digging up some garden soil and putting it in the pot. And that's just because that'll be really heavy and there won't be enough oxygen for the roots. So using something that is soilless, like this top picture, you can see it has a lot of perlite in it. That's that white stuff. And it will just be really airy and hold some oxygen for your plant roots. Also, a benefit of using the soilless mix is that it won't have any disease inside of it or any weed seed. So that's nice. That's one benefit that you won't have if you're using garden soil. You'll definitely have some weeds. So using a lightweight mix is best. They will need more fertilizer than most of our crops just because it'll drain out so quickly when you're watering your pot every day. So usually they'll need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the most amounts. And you can see on this fertilizer package that those are the three numbers that I've circled. So nitrogen is first, phosphorus, and potassium. And often if you're planting tomatoes or flowers of any kind, they will need a lot of nitrogen. So something high in that first number, you can see this one's a 6, but even if you can find something higher than that, they'll do best with high nitrogen. And this says lawn fertilizer. A lot of times the lawn fertilizers do have heavy nitrogen, and that's fine to use those as well, as long as they don't have any weed preventer in them. You can also find like water-soluble fertilizers that you can water with your pot when you water every day. That's helpful as well. So I know a lot of people will put rocks or pebbles in the bottom of their container. If you have a really big container, some people like to fill that up before they put soil in there. It's really best if you can to put in soilless potting mix all the way to the top, which I know that can be expensive to buy multiple bags of that soil mix, but it really gives your roots more room to grow clear to the bottom instead of rocks in the bottom. But I understand if it's a huge container, sometimes you don't have the option to do anything else. So. In containers, like I said, you can do almost anything, but I wanted to kind of focus on vegetables because I know a lot of us are wanting to plant vegetables right now and have some healthy food this summer. And I wanted to show you that you don't need to have a big garden to do that. So there are newer varieties of vegetables that are called dwarf varieties, which just means that they're smaller and they will do great in pots. So I went to the Bullet greenhouse over the weekend, and they had little tiny miniature tomatoes that were already growing in pots, and you could just buy the whole pot. So I think that's really fun. You can definitely grow a wide variety of vegetables in any kind of pot you have, really. It doesn't have to be a super big pot. Even if you're growing some lettuce or something like that, using a smaller one is okay, as long as you're making sure it stays watered. We talked about the first week, we talked about herbs on the webinar, and herbs are so great in containers. So if you've never grown herbs but want to this year, just pop some in a container and they'll do awesome. So you can directly seed them or buy a transplant from a greenhouse or garden center, and that will do just great. There's even sweet corn that is bred to do well in small spaces like a container. So this picture of corn is called On Deck, which I love that because you can just put it right on your deck. I believe it's from Burpee Seeds, but it's a variety that they bred to do well in a very small space. So even if you want some sweet corn this summer but don't want to till up a big plot of land, you can definitely use a container. And I think it looks kind of fun. So a lot of vegetables are great additions to your landscape. They can add some interest, and you're also getting food from them. So they are awesome. This picture shows kind of how you can situate vegetables in the pot and just how much you can actually do. So this is from a publication that K-State put out, and I will put a link to it as well so that you have that information. But in these 24-inch pots, you can see that this one on the left has 2 dwarf tomatoes, 3 basil, and then some salad mix in there as well. So you can really get a lot out of that small space. And then the one on the right has even more. It has lots of beets and radishes and lettuce and even some pole beans. So don't think that you just have to plant one thing in each pot. You can really kind of create a mix. So this publication that I'll send out also has information on those dwarf varieties that I talked about that do well in small spaces. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about pests. So let's first have a little quiz. If anybody knows what these 2 pests are, you can shout it out or type it in the chat. The first picture is a little tricky. Hopefully, a lot of people probably know the second one. But if you have any idea, you can share.
2 looks like squash bug.
Yes.
First
Yep.
one, I don't see anything.
Yeah, the second picture, so the one on the right, is a squash bug. And you can see those little orange eggs that it just laid. So that's also important to look for when we're thinking about insects. The first picture, it's a little tricky because you're not actually seeing the insect in this picture, but those are spider mites. So a lot of times on tomatoes, we'll get a spider mite infestation, and they're actually on the underside of the leaves. So you kind of have to flip your leaf over and look at the bottom, and you'll see the little spider mites. You can see the leaves kind of turned yellow and sick looking, and that's because the spider mites, they use their little mouth parts to suck the plant juice out of the leaf. So that's kind of why it looks so sick. They're just literally eating the plant juices. So what I recommend, I know it's hard, and I know we get lots of insects, but try to look at your crops every day. Maybe in the morning, if you're having a coffee and you want to walk through your garden and look for insects, you can make sure you're scouting them every day, because literally they can quadruple overnight. So once those little eggs hatch, you'll have hundreds of squash bugs, all of a sudden. So hopefully you are scouting it and monitoring your crops, and you can find those eggs and, wipe those eggs off so that they're not becoming full squash bugs. make sure that you are identifying your pest correctly. So if you find a beetle or a bug and you don't know what it is, Kelsey and I are glad to help. You can send us a picture or we can come look at what you found, but making sure you know what you're dealing with is important. That way you know how to control it. Make sure that you are applying your pesticide or whatever you're using to control the insect where the insect is located. So like I said, the spider mites are on the bottom of the leaves. And actually that's true with usually aphids and a lot of other insects. They'll be on the bottom of the leaf just because it's protected under there. It's cooler under the leaf and that's where they like to be. So just spraying the top of the tomato plant isn't going to do much good. You really need to try to get up underneath where they're at. And actually for spider mites, a lot of times you don't need a pesticide. You can just spray them down with a heavy stream of water and that'll just kind of wash the plant off and it gets rid of those little spiders. So that's nice that we don't need to use some heavy chemical to get rid of them often. And then sometimes we will have to repeat applications just because those populations will double or triple or whatever once all those eggs hatch. So they can really get crazy quick. So, but Kelsey and I or anyone at your local extension office are always happy to help. If your plant looks sick or you find a bug and you don't know what it is, we are very happy to help you figure it out and figure out how to control it. So, okay, so that's all I had for tonight. These are some of the resources I used. The first week of the webinar, I talked about the Kansas Garden Guide. It's just a really great resource to have. So it's all available online, or you can buy a copy at your local extension office. So it just has a section on every vegetable and how to grow it, and it's really helpful to have in your toolbox. And then I talked about that recommended vegetable variety list. It's a really great thing to use when you're out shopping and know what would do well in Kansas. And then there's also that growing vegetables in pots. That's where those pictures came from that showed how many vegetables you can put in a pot. So it's a nice publication to have. So I will put all of this in the email I'm going to send after this meeting. And that email will also have a quick survey. So if you could fill that out, that would really help us. It's been a weird time with these webinars, but if you could help us out by doing that, we really appreciate that. So I know Kelsey and I really miss having in-person presentations and getting to meet all of you, but this is kind of being our substitute right now. So it's working right now, but hopefully soon we'll be back to somewhat normal. So here's my contact information if you need any of that. And then you should also have our emails because I sent out the link today. So I will go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing. And then if you have any questions, I'll hang out and I can answer anything you might have.
Appreciate these seminars.
Good. I'm glad you liked them.
I could have used it last year for sure.
Do you already have your garden planted?
Yeah, pretty much. I'd like to throw in some container stuff too. I think would be kind of fun.
Yeah, it's fun. It's kind of nice to do both.
And I've seen where you can buy like the mini fruit trees, or you can do like limes and lemons and stuff. Do those grow really good in Kansas?
Yeah, you just have to make sure you're bringing them inside over the summer or the winter, because our winters.
And then what do they do in the winter? I mean, do they keep producing in the winter, or do they go dormant, or?
I believe they kind of go into a dormant state. I don't think they are producing. I've never tried one, so I don't know, but I know people that have and have had success. So
Okay.
yeah, it's fun if you have like a sunroom or something, or a good window where you could put it in the winter. I think it'd be great.
Ooh. I thought it'd be kind of fun to try one of like the little mini lemon trees. I thought would be kind of neat, but I didn't know what to do with it in the winter.
Yeah. All right.